I want to, first of all, thank David and Dragon for inviting me to participate in the conference. It's a really big thing for me to do, partly because I get to see all these old friends, some of whom were surprises, Elise, Lane, and then new friends as well. So I'm really happy to be here. And I should say too that in particular I want to cite two folks here, and I'll say in public stuff that I guess I would be too shy to say to them in private. When things are going really well, and I think I actually am doing something worthwhile, I imagine that I'm saying something that Nahum Chandler would have said in a better, more intelligent way. And I imagine that I'm saying that by way of the work of Jacques Derrida, and who it's a way that would be replete with detours and washed out, broken bridges, but still that way. By way of my old teachers, who I guess were students of his, especially Barbara Johnson. So I want to invoke her even though she's not here. So it's like an interesting, big kind of thing for me, something I would not have dreamed of 20 years ago when I first started trying to read grammatology, which I'm still not finished with. The first thing I'm going to do is play some music, which will be good, hopefully, because it's early and maybe wake everybody up a little bit. And I'll give a little bit of a preface to the music and then talk about the structure that this presentation is going to take, which would be all kind of rushed and cramped. This paper is called Uplifting Criminality, Du Bois and the Erotics of the Fugitive Voice. And obviously I can't read the whole thing because it's too long. But what I want to do is sort of run through it in a certain kind of way. And I'll do that by sort of reversing the order of the sections of the paper. So that by the end of the presentation, I'm going to read the first 4 pages of this paper, which, I'm just going to read the preface of the paper last. So I'm trying to work my way back to the preface, so to speak. The first thing that I should say is that this paper was prompted by some music and some sounds. And the two folks whose voices I'll be playing today, Rashawn Roland Kirk. It's this great song called The Business Ain't Nothing But the Blues. And another is a part of the recorded autobiography of W.B. Du Bois, made in 1961, a couple years before he died. And what I'm interested in these sounds is something that this great poet and writer and critic Nathaniel Mackey calls fugitivity in the voice, a kind of troubling of the voice. And I'm interested in the relationship between that fugitivity, that troubling, the kind of raspy scar on the surface of the voice. I'm interested in the kind of relationship between that troubling of the voice and the kind of troubling of truth, or troubling of science, troubling of a certain kind of scientific project in Du Bois, and what the relationship is between that scientific project and Du Bois's politics, his political activism. And in trying to work through this, I'll hope to address, even if it's just obliquely, some of the kind of provocative questions that Professor Sundstrom was asking Professor Chandler yesterday, regarding Du Bois's politics, his elitism, his sexism, and so forth, and try and talk about why it is that he is still so deeply important in spite of, and in some senses because of, those problematics. And another thing that I'll try and address obliquely, it has to be obliquely, I'm just going to say that I'm going to address it, and then not address it, and hoping in not addressing it I've addressed it, is something that Professor Bollivar spoke about last night by way of Professor Paul Gilroy. And I'll just say it sort of out front, and maybe it'll become clear what I mean at the end. Sometimes I think most of the time I'm desperately trying not to talk about race, and I'm totally interested all the time in trying to talk about blackness. And obviously these two things are not separable in any discrete and absolute way. But my desire to talk about blackness as opposed to race is sort of bound up with a desire to linger in some space between depth and surface, between essence and construction, and that's the place where this paper is meant to reside. And that's all I'll say about it, and then maybe we can talk about it at the end. But for now, I have to get up and play this music. So the first is Rashawn Roland Kirk, and I guess the key point to keep in mind is when you're listening to him, he's playing the flute on this particular cut. When you listen to this particular cut, recognize what Mackey calls, by way of Robert Duncan, the meta voice, which technically is Rashawn Roland Kirk humming into the flute, and it produces this sort of buzz or hum that kind of troubles or disturbs the otherwise, reportedly pure tone of the flute. And that troubling of the voice, that troubling of the instrument by the voice, will then be reversed in the Du Bois section that we hear. And what we'll hear there would be something like a troubling of the voice by the instrument. And the question is what the instrument is, what the politics of this instrument, the politics of this troubling instrumentality actually is. say that when I think about that troubling of the tone of the flute that Kirk is deploying, kind of think about it as like an anti-apocalyptic tone recently adopted, or an anti-apocalyptic overtone recently adopted, which, and I'll trace that adoption back to Du Bois, and this is that.
I came back from Berlin in 1892, and then there was the question as to where and what I was going to work in the United States. There wasn't, of course, the slightest chance of my getting any position in a white university, in spite of the fact that I had had better education than most white students had had. First, I tried to see if I could get in a colored school, either a college or even public school. One public school down in Tennessee considered me for a while, but thought I had rather too much education for them. Then I got an offer from Wilberforce. Now, I knew something about Wilberforce. Wilberforce at first was known as Tawawa Springs out in southern Ohio, where a good many Southerners used to come up for their vacations. Then it became a place where they sent their colored children for education. And finally, it was bought by the Negro Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they established a college there. And I was offered a position there, which I accepted immediately, $800 a year. Just after I had accepted that, I got an offer from Tuskegee, Booker, Washington. If I had got that offer first, I would have taken it, but I had already promised to go to Wilberforce, so that I didn't. Then I got another offer from Missouri at $1,500 a year. But money didn't mean anything to me then. I had offered to go to Wilberforce. I didn't know anything about this Missouri institution, and still I went to Wilberforce. There I stayed 2 years, rather difficult years. The institution, of course, was of rather low grade, but with a great deal of devotion and enthusiasm. And I had ideas of turning it into a great German institution of learning. I ran against the religious difficulties, well, in other ways. For instance, I wore my cane and gloves always, because in Germany, if you didn't wear cane and gloves, you were practically naked. I never have been a person with a very great sense of religion. I was fairly orthodox, but certainly not fundamental. And so I walked with my cane and gloves into a prayer meeting and sit down at the back, and then the student who was carrying on the prayer meeting says, "We will be led in prayer by Professor Du Bois." And I said, "No, you won't." And I came to losing my job there because the bishops were outraged. Of course, everybody led in prayer there, and they had revivals. Well, that made initial difficulties, and I knew that in the end they would get rid of me because I wasn't orthodox enough. Still, I had a nice 2 years there, and I had some very good students, and we did some extra good work. The only difficulty was I was teaching Latin and Greek when my specialty was sociology, and they didn't have any sociology, and they didn't want me to teach it. Then I got my chance. I was asked to come to the University of Pennsylvania to make a study of the Negro population of the 7th Ward of Philadelphia. The people of Philadelphia were quite certain that the bad political actions of these Negroes caused all the bad government in Philadelphia. But they knew that was true, but they wanted it proved in an academic way. Of course, I couldn't be an instructor, I couldn't be a scholar because I already had my PhD from Harvard, but they made me an assistant instructor, which meant that I didn't do any instruction, but that I did make this study, and I made it on my own plan. I didn't ask the department what to do. I laid before them a plan of study, and they accepted it. And in a year and a half work, I made this study of the Philadelphia Negro, which even today is recognized as a good sort of social study. And it's been very widely used. That was my second book. My first book was my thesis at Harvard, which became the first number of the Harvard Historical Series. Then, after I finished this study at the University of Pennsylvania, or before I finished it, the question with me was how this kind of study could be carried on and applied to the whole Negro problem in the United States, because, as I said and increasingly believed, the Negro problem was a matter of knowledge, that we were talking about it and we didn't know anything about it, that just because a man was born a Negro didn't mean that he knew what all the other millions were doing, and that what we needed was an academic study of the American Negro. And I wanted the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard and Yale and so forth to go into a sort of partnership by which this kind of study could be forwarded. But they, of course, didn't do anything at all. But Atlanta University, which was a Negro institution down in Atlanta, Georgia, asked me to come down there and teach and take charge of such a study. So that in 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro, or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there, there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then, when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
I don't have much time. 5 minutes, okay. What I was trying to do in this paper was to follow up on kind of a clue, I guess, that I heard in Du Bois's voice that became more insistent, it seems to me, as that particular episode continues. That insistent, troubling, and disturbing whistle that that attends his speech, and that troubles his discourse, and that, for me, at least in my view, marks or replicates that troubling of truth, or of a certain project for truth, a scientific project, the relation of a certain scientific project to political aspiration that Du Bois talks about in that section. It's as if that whistle, that meta voice, that troubling becomes more pronounced as he talks about Sam Hose. And like I said before, I think that it indicates a kind of troubling of Du Bois's voice that I think it does well for us to remark upon and to think about nowadays. And when I say that, I mean specifically to try to challenge a certain tendency on the part of some scholars to think about Du Bois's elitism, to think about Du Bois's sexism, to think about Du Bois's complicated bourgeois morality as reasons not to continue to take into account the particular form and particular direction that his radicalism took, and which made possible a certain kind of intellectual formation, which for me remains not only absolutely crucial and important, but is the condition of possibility of my being here before you today. People like Kevin Gaines, whose work I greatly respect, in a book called Uplifting the Race, takes Du Bois to task really hard for his elitism, takes the whole project of Uplift to task for that elitism. People like Tara Hunter, again, a person whose work I respect greatly, takes Du Bois to task especially hard for his continued and insistent, well, for two things. One, a kind of sexism and even misogyny that manifests itself in a way that allows you to understand black femininity to be that which holds back black uplift. That's that which makes it impossible in a certain sense. When black women go out and work outside the home, they violate a kind of domesticity which for Du Bois, to the extent that that domesticity is all bound up with the achievement of a kind of bourgeois normativity which at a certain moment he thinks of as the destiny of blacks on some level, or at least a part of that destiny, maybe even an instrument of that destiny. But to the extent that he imagines kind of assertive black femininity or black female subjectivity to constitute a danger to that or a violation of that, Tara Hunter takes him to task. And I think it's right to take him to task. He should be taken to task. But it's equally important to recognize that there is a kind of architrace, which I think of as both maternal and criminal, which animates Du Bois's work, both at the level of content and at the level of form. Right? And that revolutionary quality that is in Du Bois's work and that animates and disturbs his voice, and that animates and disturbs his sociological project almost at its inception. And it's important to recognize that it is almost at its inception that this disturbance takes place. I think it's something which Du Bois both attempts in certain ways to repress, but it is also a kind of motive force or active, energizing, disturbing essentiality to his work that he constantly embraces and constantly attempts to replicate. Right? So that in a certain sense, what I'm arguing is that there's a kind of grammatical and also at the same time phonic disruption or disturbance, a constant politicized eruption of phonic materiality that is irreducible in Du Bois's work, and that is fundamentally a part of his politics, and that he recognizes as a fundamental part of his politics. So it's important to recognize that the normative voice of Du Bois, the normative voice that attempts to argue that, for a certain kind of, like I said, bourgeois normativity, certain forms of normative sexuality, that normative voice is also always being troubled by this fugitive meta voice, right, that we hear in the that we hear by 1961 as something almost at the, Well, one way to put it is that if Du Bois constitutes something like the origins of a certain discourse of urban black pathology, that pathology is something which Du Bois also recognizes as one of the fundamental conditions of possibility for black rebellion. And that pathology reanimates Du Bois's voice as a kind of speech pathology, if you will. That speech pathology is what, again, Nate Mackey would call fugitivity. And that fugitivity is what I'm interested in. It's a fugitivity that we can think about along a number of different lines. The opening of this paper, which I was going to read, but I won't read now, starts with an attempt to take into account some formulations which Winfried Menninghaus makes at the beginning of his book called In Praise of Nonsense. Subtitle is Kant and Bluebeard, which is cool. I'll just read one quote. This is Menninghaus. All the richness of the imagination, Kant cautions in the Critique of Judgment, in its lawless freedom produces nothing but nonsense. Nonsense then does not befall the imagination like a foreign pathogen. Rather, it is the very law of imagination's own lawlessness. Kant therefore prescribes a rigid antidote. Even in the field of the aesthetic, understanding must severely clip the wings of imagination and sacrifice some of it. I'm interested in a sort of resistance to this politics of curtailment. And I'm interested in the sort of lawless freedom of imagination as it plays itself out phonically in Du Bois's work, and also as it plays itself out with regard to the politics in Du Bois's work, which is also a politics of this meta voice. Anyway, I should probably just stop there because, I was trying to do a whole bunch of stuff here and there's not enough time to really get through it, but hopefully said enough to at least generate some questions. So thank you.